First thing is I talked about that intelligence piece. In February of last year, actually, General Mike Flynn, who is General McChrystal's chief of intelligence, published a paper through our think tank, actually, very much criticizing the way in which we were gathering intelligence in Afghanistan, the way in which we were processing it, the types of questions we were asking. And it very much got at that same problem that we had identified the summer before that, which is that we were still overwhelmingly focused on the enemy, but we were in this environment in which the Taliban, the Haqqani network, these guys were not the only things that were driving the conflict. By contrast, when I talked to battalion and brigade S2s, intelligence officers, in this most recent trip, I was tremendously impressed by the sophistication of their understanding of their battle space environments. It's hard to believe that things had changed just over 18 months, but apparently the memos had filtered down to the tactical units. And when you talk to these folks, men and women who are working really at the division, brigade, and battalion levels, it was just very easy to be impressed with the way in which they were conceiving of their areas of operation. So when I visited one brigade in Jalalabad, for example, and was talking to the assistant intelligence officer of this brigade. And I was like, well, tell me about your area of operations. Well, it was like pulling the cord on a chatty Cathy doll. He immediately started talking about here's who lives here, who's fighting who, they're building a road here, this tribe is fighting this tribe because they're angry about this road that's being built and, et cetera. And it was much more sophisticated. It was not focused. We eventually talked about the insurgent groups in his area of operations, but only as one little piece of the greater tableau of what was going on inside that area of operations. The second thing I noticed was that counterinsurgency as practiced at the tactical level was some of the best I'd ever seen. So I spent a little bit of time with a company down in the Arghandab River Valley, in the northern Arghandab, which is the scene of just some ferocious fighting in October and November of last year. It was remarkable talking to this company commander, his platoon leaders, these platoon sergeants, the way in which they valued, for example, training up host nation security forces, working by, with, and through the Afghans, not just on their own, and also the aggression with which they were conducting offensive operations. These are the types of things that you can see because in places like the Arghandab River Valley, we've been able to push tremendous amounts of U.S. and Afghan resources that simply weren't there in 2007, 2008. The third thing I saw, and you can dispute the effectiveness of this strategically, but I don't think you can dispute the tactical effectiveness of this, which is the synchronization between general purpose forces and special operations forces. Our direct action special operations forces have created a tremendous amount of pressure on the insurgent networks. And even better than that, they're tremendously well synced up with the general purpose forces, the so-called battle space owners. I was traveling around with Pete Mansour, who's a professor of military history at Ohio State, but in another life had been a brigade commander in Iraq in 2003. At the same time I was there as a Ranger platoon leader. And I was laughing because in 2003, and I was teasing Pete about this, maybe I shouldn't have, in 2003 I really made his life miserable. When you have a direct action special operations task force that's running around grabbing guys out of their homes in the middle of the night looking for high-value targets while not coordinating their effects and their activities with the battle space owner, which is exactly what we were doing in 2003. This time around, I saw that very much better synchronized. And again, it was having a tremendous tactical effect on the insurgency. If your goal is to put that pressure on the insurgency to collapse the insurgent network, we're having a good effect. You could also make the opposite argument that you don't want to kill too many of the mid-level battalion and company level commanders within an insurgency, because those are the guys that you're going to need to talk to if you're trying to, say, for example, reintegrate insurgent fighters. So there's a positive and negative argument to that, which I don't want to downplay. But I think they're very much proceeding along the same assumptions that undergirded our direct action special operations in Iraq in 2007. Okay, couple do-outs. First off, the first has to do with resources. If I were, for example, a consultant from the McKinsey Corporation and you were to ask me to go to Afghanistan, look at everything it is that NATO is doing, and tell me what this organization values, what this organization treasures. Overwhelmingly, they value killing the enemy. If you look at the resources we have in the field, if you look at the focus of our efforts, if you look at the types of things that commanders are focused at, it's overwhelmingly killing the enemy. Maybe that's okay. But maybe, if, again, you think that what the Afghan government does or fails to do is at least as important as anything that the insurgents do or fail to do, then maybe your focus should also be weighted towards better governance, weighted towards anti-corruption efforts, weighted towards building up Afghan institutions. And I really don't see that within in Afghanistan. The second thing is interests while in transition. I think, again, it's still a broad... it is still a broad assumption that our interests are going to line up with those of the Afghan government going forward. I don't think that is going to be the case as we start to transition out of Afghanistan. Without a doubt, we are sometime in the next year or so, we'll negotiate some sort of agreement with the Afghan government whereby the United States will have some sort of security agreement with the Afghan government that will keep us interested in Afghanistan beyond 2014. I don't think the administration wants to talk about that for obvious political reasons, but that's just the reality. Having said that, though, as we begin to draw down our troops, I think our interests and those of the Afghan government are going to grow in stark relief between now and 2014 and beyond. Because whereas the Afghans are going to be talking about in general purposes at least, building up, what type of infrastructure we're going to leave them with, what type of development work we're going to be doing, what we're leaving with the Afghans so they can be a viable state. We're going to want to talk about overwhelmingly our security interests, and specifically transfer of lead security responsibility. So whereas the Afghan dialogue is going to be, or the Afghan side of the dialogue is going to be 80% development, 20% security, ours is going to be roughly the exact opposite. And then the final thing I would say is that the two, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be greedy, and I'm going to give you three more things to worry about. How about that? The first is the two strategic Achilles heels, which I think have to do with, and this is everybody from General Petraeus on down is honest about this, and those two strategic Achilles heels are governance and sanctuaries in Pakistan. My own sense, and I only work at the open source level for the most part, and don't have any regular access to classified information. Not that I would share it with you in this open forum with the cameras rolling, but my own sense is that we do not have an effective U.S. government strategy for dealing with sanctuaries in Pakistan. First, second thing. Again, if you talk to me about where our resources are focused, if you think that what the Afghan government does or fails to do is at least as important as what the Taliban does or fails to do, then our resources are way out of whack, and we don't have a really coherent strategy for dealing or for bolstering Afghan governance. And then the final thing is, the British General Sir Rupert Smith talks about, in this type of campaign, the best a third party, and we are a third party in Afghanistan, the best that a third party can hope to do is not to win the conflict outright, but to set the conditions for political success. So you can set security conditions, but then the host nation has to capitalize on those security conditions that you've just set. In the same way in Iraq, and I'm not saying what caused this, but you had a dramatic drop in ethno-sectarian violence over the course of 2007, and that sets the conditions for a political process. Whether or not the Iraqi government then takes advantage of those security conditions, the conditions are nonetheless set.